according to NFL insider Josina Anderson, that's exactly what's happening. Quote unquote, interesting changes will likely come to the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's what she's hearing down at the combine. While everybody left, the Steelers and Josina, they were still talking. And now we just have to ask the question, what are these changes and what's coming? I personally have almost no idea, but I could guess what the outside is going to label as interesting, because that's how I broke this down. You know, everybody talked, oh, what are these interesting changes? Big splashes. I think half the fan base, 90% of the fan base was like, stop. There are no changes coming to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Relax. And I sit on that side of the boat here, but I'll break it down what maybe interesting means in Josina's eyes and maybe anybody else who is talking. Now, the running back position is a big one. Jaylen Warren will most likely be the starter in 2025. And I think people on the outside view that as, oh, they're still talking to Najee Harris. So that's interesting that he won't come back. And from what I've heard, it's pretty unlikely that Najee Harris is coming back to the Pittsburgh Steelers and that Jaylen Warren will be the guy in 2025, followed by whoever they end up drafting. Wide receiver is the other one. And we're going to dive into options here, but look, I get what Omar said, okay? And Omar and what he did say opened up a can of worms. We had to talk about it for full 24, 48 hours. And luckily, I was in a place where you get to talk about that stuff. And then I don't go to my, other room to get a coffee. I go to Starbucks where insiders are fist fighting, and you get to actually have conversations and learn what this means and what the reality is for the Steelers. And I learned the same things that I've been told this entire offseason, and that is it's still more likely that George Pickens is not on the Steelers roster in 2025 than it is that he signs an extension. Now, that doesn't mean that he could be on the roster in 2025 without an extension. That's still very likely. But if you had to pick between the two, there's still a more prominent chance George Pickens is gone. And because of that, I would guess that is part of interesting changes, that maybe the Steelers are going to get rid of their top wide receiver, something we've already known and have known for quite some time. Then they dive into some other stuff. No Russell Wilson. I think it's extremely unlikely the Steelers re-sign Russell Wilson at this point in the offseason. Nothing I heard suggests Russ is even the backup plan, that he's even number two. Now, if the options are Russell Wilson or Daniel Jones, they're going to go with Russell Wilson. But the Steelers have some belief that Derek Carr might become available, and we'll talk about him in a second. They have some belief that Sam Darnold is going to become available, and we'll talk about him in a second. They have some interest in 2 or 3 quarterbacks in the NFL draft, and they are pretty sold that Justin Fields is going to return to the Steelers because his giant market outside of Pittsburgh might not be so giant, and the Steelers might be able to wiggle themselves in a little bit to make this a satisfying offer for Justin Fields. Then you're looking at the other side of the football, and that's where the interesting thing takes place. I would imagine that conversations were had where Larry O's gone. Cole Holcomb is probably coming back, but as a backup role. The Steelers are going to completely reshape their defensive line in 2025. Those are the things. A veteran corner who might not be named Dante Jackson might end up in Pittsburgh, but that's where they're going. Those are all things we have talked about. They're all things we've laid out before. I would imagine they all classify in the interesting changes that the Steelers are making in 2025. So unfortunately, for everybody who sat there and said, oh, baby, this is going to be big, you now need to mold yourself into the rest of everybody else who sat there and said, this is nothing. Nothing's going on, because it's all the same stuff that we've been talking about. I don't see any massive splash, different splash. You trade George Pickens, massive splash. You sign Derek Carr, massive splash. You sign Sam Darnold, massive splash. But I think that's as big and crazy as it gets. And it seems like the outside looking in, you're not as aware of these changes. So you hear them, and that's what you're looking for. I would expect that's what interesting changes mean. I know I just went on a 5-minute rant explaining all the things that we already knew were going down in Pittsburgh this offseason, but it's important to lay out what, I heard prior to this tweet. Again, I was not there when she tweeted out. I was already on my way back home here and then to Scranton to see my parents. And I got the news like everybody else. That's what I expect to happen. Did you have other ideas in mind?
No, and I think the big thing here is it was probably something that Josina Anderson felt was interesting simply because of the things that you laid out. Like the both of us, we live and die off of what is happening with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and we are interested in outside teams, but for the most part, we focus on Pittsburgh, so we know what's going on a day-to-day basis more so than a national analyst. Could Josina Anderson have been talking to somebody about the defense, talking to somebody about TJ Watt's extension, and they said, yeah, they're going to pay him, but they're going to expect him to move around, and she could have been like, oh, that's interesting. Like,
Yeah.
You're going to force TJ Watt out of his comfort zone and tell him to move around, like something at that level, which if you live and die Pittsburgh Steelers, if you've paid attention to all of the press clippings, if you have looked at what TJ Watt has said since the end of the season, you would say, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. TJ Watt himself said that he is going to have to move around because people have figured out that he is going to be on one side and one side only, and it is too easy to take him out of the game now. So he has been saying this. So everybody that's been paying attention specifically to the Steelers has seen that. But if somebody's just paying attention to the main headlines because they have to pay attention to 32 NFL franchises, then it makes sense that something as minor as that would still classify as interesting. But what you laid out there, I mean, George Pickens, that would be interesting too. The quarterback situation, anything outside of bringing back one or the other, which has been predominantly the conversation of it's going to be Russ, it's going to be Justin, or it's going to be nobody else. If they open the door for anybody else, a national insider is going to look at that and say, that's not what everybody else expected. So that's interesting to me. So again, it is very vague, just thrown out there. Yeah, I heard there's going to be some interesting changes because the definition of interesting is very much so in the eye of whoever is saying it. So I'm interested to see what Josina thinks is interesting. And whenever it comes, I want to know, I want to know what she's talking about because I'm interested.
Yeah, I agree. I also like I mean, great for her for getting the scoop, but like how long we waiting for this interesting thing? Because I want to know. I want to know what interesting changes are coming to the Pittsburgh Steelers. If we guessed them, I also want to know if we're wrong. I want to know if I was like, whoa, dude, totally missed that one. Shout out to Josina because I have been way out of the loop on, Patrick Queen moving to safety, Minka getting traded to wherever, or Myles Garrett coming to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Like, I just don't know what's going on, but I agree. And I am interested to see what these interesting changes could be for the Steelers. But for anybody holding your breath, sitting there thinking something big's coming, I have not heard anything big is coming. I mean, it depends on what you classify as big, but I have not heard anything that we haven't talked about already is on the move, on the way for the Pittsburgh Steelers.